So, my name is Helen Grace. I am a member of DC IWOC, which stands for the DC chapter of the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, as well as a few different groups around DC.
How did you get involved with IWOC and DC Mutual Aid Network in general?
hmm So, I got involved with IWOC last year. I'd been doing organizing in a lot of different ways that intersect with supporting incarcerated people. But more specifically, last year, there were a lot of really heinous things happening in the Alabama prison systems. So, we formed a coalition of different groups. IWOC was a part of that group. To be able to support some of those needs getting met, particularly because one, in DC, we don't have a prison. And so a lot of people from DC get shipped out to facilities around the country. And two, because Alabama already had been investigated by the Department of Justice. However, the Department of Justice, although it found that there were really horrendous things happening behind bars, such as the bucket detail, which was a particularly just like terrible abuse of power where COs would have people who are coming into facilities kept in a dry room, meaning they don't get any water, they don't get any food for 5 days with their hands and legs shackled and like their pants taped, and they wouldn't be able to leave that cell until they defecated into a bucket. They claimed that this was to like check for drugs or make sure drugs weren't entering the facilities, but it was used a lot retaliate like as a retaliation mechanism against people who were raising um, alarm about what was happening inside the prisons. There have been a lot of overcrowding, and although the Department of Justice found that these things were happening, they didn't actually do anything to create any sense of accountability or any sense of change. So we collaborated with them to get the attention of the Department of Justice since their headquarters are here. So that was a lot of how my involvement in IWOC began.
Okay, wow, dang. Yeah, I've heard some crazy things happening in prisons and youth facilities happen before, but I didn't hear about that particular one. No. So real quick, just so I have it down right, what does IWOC stand for again?
Sure, the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee.
Workers Organizing Committee. Okay, I
Mhm.
had that one wrong. Okay, gotcha. And how does mutual aid um, tie into like the philosophy of mutual aid? How does that tie into the work you do with them?
So I got pulled into the mutual aid work through some of the organizing that I've been doing here in DC. So I also am a part of a group called Cop Watch DC, which monitors police brutality in the district and helps folks document harm that might have been caused to them, supports folks who may have been arrested and detained or locked up. And mutual aid really fits into the work that I've been doing because, for example, in IWalk, we do what's called arraignment support. So on the weekends, we are outside of DC court. We bring food, we bring, clothes, um, anything like that we can kind of predict our immediate needs, cell phones for people to make phone calls from, shoelaces, cigarettes if people want them, for folks who are coming out of court, out of their arraignment hearing, because people who are held overnight, they most often don't get anything to eat, they don't get anything to drink, they have to
Oh,
wait for hours on end before they actually see the judge, because in DC everyone gets to see a judge within 24 hours, or they're supposed to. However, what happens in between seeing that judge is not necessarily like kind and caring
yeah.
treatment. So we do that outside of the court for folks who then are allowed to be no papered, or who are released on pretrial. And that's a form of mutual aid insofar as we're just folks who are in the community who care, who are able to provide certain things that either for folks who've gone through the system know that these are things that they wanted, or hearing feedback from folks that these are forms of care. And then other folks who come out, often they will say like, well, I want to be a part of this. I want to be able to support because I went through this and I didn't expect anyone to be out here. Sometimes people have gone through the system multiple times, and they happen to come out on a day when we're out there. Unfortunately, we can't be out there every single
Yeah.
day. And, they'll say like, what, this means a lot, like to know that you don't even know me and you care about like what happens to me once I leave this court. And so I think it makes people realize that they don't necessarily need a government system to determine like what care do they deserve or like getting their needs met, and then feel empowered to do so for other people. And sometimes people will like kind of linger, you know, maybe they're getting something to eat and they'll see someone else who was inside. They're like, hey, did you ever get this thing figured out? Like, hey, let's try to figure this out together. People will coordinate rides with each other, you know, simple things like that. But I think that really make people see that the power is within the people and not necessarily like these giant systems that they just had to encounter that held their life in their, you know, in their hands.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's cool. It's great. Um, it's great having people on your side and with you and who understand what you've been through. Um, that's cool that you're doing that for them. So with that, then, so that you talked a little bit of mutual aid right there with that organization. What does mutual aid mean to you, or what is it to you?
Mhm. I think to me, mutual aid is generating the power within our communities to be able to provide care for ourselves. So often we're socialized into believing that care is like a top down thing. Like you need someone who has more power, more authority to determine what you have access to. And the things that you have access to, you have to like deserve it, right? It's based on like this meritocracy. I think mutual aid disrupts that assumption. It helps us think through what is the care that we need, what are the actual mechanisms of receiving that care, and can it be something that's actually generated from not just within the community but especially folks who might be more marginalized. And I think that it's taken the form of people like communities that have been more marginalized and vulnerable have been doing mutual aid for the longest times. You know, when we think about just the US alone, you know, a lot of groups like, for example, the Black community could not access certain governmental benefits, right? Like we literally have a country that's structured on enslaving and murdering folks who are non-white. And so Black communities had to generate creating their goods and services within the community itself. So that looked like things like creating their own jobs. It looked like creating your own systems of medicine, of healthcare, of, you know, child care. When, you know, you couldn't necessarily access that through Jim Crow, because of Jim Crow, or, you know, other structures of oppression. And I think we've seen throughout like our country's history different groups who've taken that on in different ways. For example, the Black Panther Party, you know, which some people don't actually know, like the free breakfasts that like US public schools have is because of the Black Panther Party having a free breakfast program where not only did they feed people, but they also provided that political education so that, you know, people were getting multiple needs met, right? Being able to understand the oppression that they were facing and how it was intentional, while also being able to get an immediate need met, like feeding children, feeding families. And of course, like the government co-ops that too, right? Because the government doesn't actually want us to feel like we can generate our own needs, or that we can meet our own needs. It's disempowering to the government and these different systems of oppression. So, you know, just want to also highlight that we're seeing that in this time now too, where like, you know, the DC government is using the language of mutual aid and accountability. And it's not a
Mhm.
surprise when we think about, well, of course they want to use the language that, you know, finally makes people feel empowered and autonomous to then take it again and then make it something that we have to depend on them to grant us.
Oh, wow. Think about that last part. Yeah, I learned quite a bit about the Black Panthers when I was in school. Actually, I was surprised because the people in my other schools did not. I was like, "Why is this?" And then like I learned how they were shut down. I'm like, "Oh, that's why." um,
Exactly.
but yeah, one second. I've had a throat problem for a little bit. So. But yeah, thank you for going a bit into the history of that and whatnot, because that was kind of going to be my next question about what's the history of mutual aid to you and whatnot. And I know it's been around for a while before this. I think I read it was started by like I forgot, somebody in the Marxist Lenin camp, but it's like it quickly spread from there, and
Mhm.
seen it from many different things. I just got from the Jewish person that I met the other day, gave me a really like mutual aid to her was really looking in your community and seeing where there was an unmet need that you could possibly fulfill. And I'm just loving these different kind of complementary views of mutual aid that I'm getting from everybody.
Definitely. And I think that it's really important to highlight that mutual aid isn't charity. And I think it's important to, like, if we're not examining what power looks like when we're doing mutual aid, then we're not doing mutual aid. If, like, what you're looking at, like, what you're creating, doesn't have any kind of reciprocity, like, where you see yourself in the person or people that you're providing aid to, and that they also see themselves in you, and that it seems like something that can be collaborative, then it's really not mutual aid. And I think a few months ago, before all of this happened, I had asked people, like, how do you know that what you're doing is mutual aid? Like, where is the mutuality in the aid that you are doing? And I think sometimes that's the part that we forget. Like, we're so hung up on, like, I want to support, and that we don't necessarily recognize that we are creating our own power structures within the aid that we're creating. That if we're also creating a certain kind of dependency, or like this attitude that, like, well, I gave this to you, so now you, like, owe me in this particular way, or you need to regard me in this particular way, or you're subordinate because you've received and you weren't the giver, then we are also replicating the dynamics of the state.
Yeah. And that's funny because that's come up with my friend. She worked with USIP and other like violence prevention programs in the city and whatnot. And that was like a big problem that she had with some of her colleagues. Well, she called it a little bit differently, like white knighting and stuff like
Mm,
that, where it's just like, I'm gonna come in and fix all this for you. And it's like, no, you can't fix the problem. You have to get everybody involved and board and collaborating on it. So yeah. Um, it's funny, I'm just diving into this right now, but a lot of it is like I've heard from colleagues in the past, like now that I'm able to draw the parallels. Um, so thank you for that.
yeah.
Let's see. Um, did I go over all the questions with you that I sent? How do you get involved in the mutual aid? What's mutual aid to you?
I think you
Uh,
had asked also, what will it look like, after
oh
this,
yeah.
which, I struggle with thinking of, like, an after this. Like, I kind of, I've been in a lot of spaces where people call it, like, the new normal, or they say it's not the new normal, or whatever. And I guess, to me, it's not something that we can really think of having a conclusion, right? We also shouldn't want things to return to what, like, the old normal was, because the old normal functioned because of, like, inequity. And I think that what I'm hoping is that as we move forward, that more and more people are connected in these, like, small unit ways, right? That you don't necessarily have to be connected to every single person in Northwest if that's where you live, but maybe it makes you closer connected to your neighbors, right? And maybe because you and your neighbors feel closer connected, you are able to operate as a unit that builds power for yourselves, right? That you're able to say, if one of us is suffering, all of us are suffering, and you're able to continue to provide care in that way. Maybe it doesn't necessarily look like responding to COVID. It might not look like getting medicine for each other or groceries for each other. It might look like, I think that my neighbor is being evicted, and is there a support that I can provide for this person? It could be, I recognize that my housemate is in a relationship that seems abusive, and instead of waiting to intervene when something absolutely terrible happens, what if I intervene when something looks smaller, because I care and I feel invested and I feel safe in showing that investment? Like, I think these are the ways that I hope, like, our mutual aid will grow and develop. I'm hoping that some of the things that we've already set up will feel more permanent, isn't really the word, but more sustainable, that will be able to continue looking out for people who might not be able to get groceries, or thinking about what accessibility looks like and what could be more accessible in the ways that we show up for each other. And that, like, the same communities that we're recognizing are most at risk in, like, COVID-19, like, that we remember that these communities have always been at most risk for everything else, right? That the reason why that these communities are at higher risk are because they're at higher risk, for everything else, because they are the most marginalized and the most vulnerable, and that we keep prioritizing those communities and placing leadership in those communities to determine what care looks like and change looks like.
All right. Okay, cool. Um, also, I think people sometimes struggle with like they sometimes see mutual aid and they think it's like a volunteer group or volunteering and whatnot. Um, like what do you say to them who's like that? that they're like, oh, that's just you volunteering to help your friend or volunteering to do this stuff. What makes the key difference between mutual aid and volunteering for you?
hmm I guess volunteering kind of sounds like very non-profity. Like, you're
Mhm.
on the low, maybe getting something out of it. Like, oh, I got my internship credit for volunteering. But in a way, I feel like it sort of is, to the extent that like you shouldn't actually be looking for some greater return other than like the mutual care that you're giving, right? Like, I think sometimes people will invalidate the work because they're like, oh well, you're volunteering to do this, it's not like it's your job, like you should stop, like you could stop at any particular time. And I think once we can actually see our oppression as interconnected, and like take this as like an opportunity for collective liberation. Like, volunteering, I feel like what makes it like an annoying word is because it's completely removed from like any kind of political stake, any kind of sense of collective liberation, versus like providing mutual aid. You see that like if you are thriving, I am thriving. If the person who is struggling the most in my community is thriving and surviving, then we all are. And that we are like lifting from the roots versus saying like, okay, like if you can catch up to the rest of us being able to receive this perk, then like you're good, like, just work harder and you can enjoy all the benefits that we all are. I think volunteering doesn't actually want to change. Like, generally when people are volunteering for something, it's like treating a symptom of what's wrong and not actually treating like the disease that is happening, which feels a little weird to say in a pandemic, but that we're saying, oh, I see that this person is unhoused, so I'm going to volunteer to bring food, and like, I hope that you enjoy this like sandwich that I made you. I'll see you like 2 weeks from now when I have another sandwich to give you. um, Instead of saying like, not only will I, can we work together to make sure that that immediate need is met, but also what can happen to change the circumstances of like whatever the situation is, the displacement of this person, or what other contributing factors are happening.
Oh yeah, definitely. A lot of intersectionality in there for you, huh? That's okay. Thank you very much for talking with me briefly about this. Is there anything else that you would wanted to add, or that you think people should know about the subject?
I think that's mostly it for
Mhm.
folks who are interested in learning more about specifically, mutual aid. We have a Facebook group as well as an Instagram. The Instagram, I think, is a little bit easier to have access to. As well, DC IWOC is on Instagram as DC IWOC, and if there are ways that folks want to plug in, we definitely invite that.